Hello, I'm Dr. Garrett Boyer. Welcome to Gospel Minded, where we spend a few minutes each week talking about psychology, our emotions, behavioral health, and we reflect on how these important topics are related to the Gospel reading for each Sunday. Like I point out every week, this isn't any sort of substitute for actually going to church or participating in therapy or spiritual direction if you're engaged in those sort of practices. But like we know and like we've seen, so often things of our mind, things of our psychology go hand in hand with our spirituality. If you're new to Gospel Minded, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. I invite you to subscribe to my channel so that you never miss an episode of Gospel Minded. For the past several weeks, we've been talking about the Gospel of John, as that's been where we've seen our Gospel readings come from for the past several weeks. But now this week, we're back to the Gospel of Mark, and it's a really interesting Gospel today. It starts with chapter 7, and I want to read these first few lines to set up where I want the discussion today to go. It says, "Now when the Pharisees gathered together to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands, observing the tradition of the elders. And they come from the marketplace, and they do not eat unless they purify themselves. And there are many other traditions which they observe, the washing of cups and pots and vessels of bronze. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, 'Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with hands defiled?' And he said to them, 'Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me.'" Wow, so interesting. This gospel reading for today, and in fact, all three readings, the first reading, the second reading, all have this overtone of adherence to the law. And as we know from the Old Testament, the law could be rather cumbersome and challenging. There's just a lot there to unpack. And again, this isn't a theological conversation, but what came to my mind when I heard that gospel reading today, this idea of the ceremonial washings, the purification of hands and cups and dishes and the pots of bronze, those are all religious themes and religious practices that the Jews had at that time. And some of them still today adhere to these different Old Testament practices. But what about those people who adhere to these sort of practices religiously that are not necessarily inherently religious? I'm thinking especially about people who struggle and wrestle with obsessions or compulsions or even religious scrupulosity. Because I'll be honest, when I hear about this consistent washing of hands, purifying of cups and dishes, distinct from what we're reading about in the gospel today, there are a lot of people who engage in these sort of practices compulsively, and it can become a disordered behavior. You've probably heard the term obsessive compulsive disorder. So I think today is a good time to talk about what that is and what that can kind of look like for different folks and how it might manifest in our own lives. Hopefully not in a disordered way, but we all have things that we can become fixated on in our minds, and there may be things, routines, habits, patterns of behaviors that we engage in with some rigid, some kind of rigid adherence, we'll say. So first of all, obsessive. What are we talking about? So obsessing is primarily a mental act, and it's when we become so engrossed and focused on something a lot of times it's an intrusive thought that we just can't seem to shake it. So when we think about somebody who has obsessive compulsive disorder, there are a lot of different things that a person could obsess on. And a lot of the common ones are thoughts of contamination or cleanliness, self-harm, or obsessing about harming others. I mean, these are examples that I've heard of that happen with a fair number of folks. And when it becomes disordered, it can really create a lot of challenges for not only the person who's having these obsessive thoughts, but a lot of the people around them, their family members, their friends, their colleagues. At the same time, what's very interesting is that the literature shows that even people who do not meet diagnostic criteria for obsessive compulsive disorders may still, throughout the course of their life, experience obsessive kinds of thoughts about different things. And perhaps you've experienced this. I believe I have. There have definitely been times where I have been obsessive about certain topics, situations, issues. And if you've ever experienced it, you know how unpleasant it is when something comes to your mind and you just can't shake it. No matter what you do, you try and distract yourself, you try and do something else to get your mind off of whatever it is, but it's just so hard to get away from that kind of thought. So think about somebody who has an obsessive compulsive disorder. It's like that idea has a grip on you almost perpetually. It sounds just very uncomfortable. But obsessions is this mental thing. And then a compulsion tends to be either a mental act or a behavior that comes about. So when we think about compulsive kinds of behaviors, these are the folks that you see who have to straighten out everything in their room or their workspace. Things have to be at just the right angle. Or for somebody who has a contamination thing going on, they'll be washing their hands a lot uh, compulsively. And this can cause problems for them, certainly because physically now their hands may become chapped and broken open with sores and this sort of thing. Another example of a compulsive behavior I've heard about is people constant checking of doors, making sure that they're locked or that lights are off. And sometimes you'll see people have almost religious sort of routines with the way they turn a light on or off. Maybe they have to flip the switch up and down a certain number of times, and they have to finish turning off the light finally with it, I don't know, ending on a multiple of 4. I mean, to you and me, it sounds kind of peculiar, but for the person who has obsessive compulsive disorder, this is normal, and the way that they have kind of conditioned themselves to be for some time. And as you hear me talk about this, you might realize, like, wow, this sounds like it could really be problematic. And often the person who has obsessive compulsive disorder recognizes that some of the things they do, some of the thoughts they have are not helpful, and in fact maybe harming themselves and people around them. This is somewhat distinct from obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And obsessive compulsive disorder and obsessive compulsive personality disorder share a lot of similar symptoms. But what's interesting about the person who is impacted in their very personality is that they may not recognize some of these behaviors and thoughts as being problematic. In fact, they might see them as absolutely right, and everybody who's not doing this or that or the other thing are wrong. And when I think about this idea of the obsessive compulsive personality disorder, I think it becomes easy to see that bleed a little bit into this religious scrupulosity. I think for those of us who are adherent Catholics and Christians, uh, it becomes challenging when we think about the rules that we have. Christianity lays out any number of rules. I mean, start with the Ten Commandments, which comes from the Old Testament. And with that, especially now think about Catholics, not eating meat on Fridays for Lent and fasting. And if you are, a traditional Catholic who doesn't eat meat many times throughout the course of the year, every Friday, for example, you think about priests and religious who do the liturgy of the hours on a daily basis. Like there can be a lot of rules depending on what your state of life is. And the rules are good. It's important that we have these rules because they set up boundaries and parameters and they keep us on a good trajectory. But when we start becoming scrupulous, I think we notice issues creeping up because a lot of times the scrupulosity isn't around those actual doctrinal rules. Rather, it becomes around rules that we make up in our own mind. So the person who's got religious scrupulosities, and I've seen many examples of this over the course of the last several years, but it's the person who gets distracted while they're praying the Our Father. And so they start obsessing. Was that the right way to pray it? Is God displeased with me because I got distracted during my prayers? Maybe I should restart it and do it again. I'm going to do it again. And then they do it again. That's kind of a silly example, but I've heard of that and seen that. Another one that I've heard of is folks that want to do the rosary. And the rosary can become easy to get distracted during. And they think, well, I need to redo this. Or I have to get all my prayers in before midnight, because if I say any prayers after midnight, then that's the next day. And for a lot of this kind of stuff, there's no doctrine defining these parameters or these rules. These are things that folks come up with in their own mind. And that scrupulosity like that can create a lot of anxiety. It can lead us to feeling anxious, can lead us to feeling sad, depressed, guilty. And those aren't things that are helpful for us, for the people around us. Does it ultimately help my relationship with God? So this is what I'll say. If you've had obsessive compulsive thoughts and behaviors, if you've had religious scrupulosities, what I challenge you to do is this. Think about how it looks in your life. I really hope that it's not to that point where it's disordered, because if it's disordered, you're going to notice a lot of challenges occupationally, with colleagues, peers, friends, family. And if that's the case and you're at that level, I would highly recommend that you consider going to therapy. Perhaps part of it means using medications to try and get to a point where you can address these things in therapy. There's no easy fix or cure or solution, but what I can say is that if you're the kind of person who's obsessive or compulsive or has religious scrupulosities, these things don't tend to just go away on their own. We need to actively seek out a way to address them so that ultimately we can flourish and feel better about ourselves, live better lives ourselves, and come to a deeper, better communion with Jesus and with those with whom we associate. So interesting stuff to think about. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you'll come back next week. I'm Dr. Garrett Boyer, here at Gospel Minded. Take care.